Good morning. It is nice to see some of you here this morning, and there are more following us online, I hope. Welcome to this masterclass. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I'm the academic director of the Holberg Prize. Now, the masterclass is an event which we host to create a space for exchange and dialogue between the Holberg Prize laureate and PhD students from or in the Nordic countries. Eventually, we would also like to involve the audience in this exchange, and you will have an opportunity to chip in later on. This morning, we have with us the 2025 Holberg Prize laureate, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She is currently holding the post of university professor in the Humanities at Columbia University, and is truly one of the most influential global intellectuals today. And I think we saw that also yesterday, both during the symposium and during the wonderful exchange between her and the Nils Klim Prize laureate at the House of Literature in Bergen. Spivak continues to shape several fields in an interdisciplinary manner. These include comparative literature, translation, post-colonial studies, political philosophy, and feminist theory. And we have, I think it's safe to say, some of those fields represented with the master students the PhD students with us here today. Spivak's scholarship has been translated into well over 20 languages. She has taught and lectured in more than 50 countries, and has received nearly 50 honorary doctorates and prizes from across the globe. In recommending Professor Spivak for the prize, the Holberg Committee notes, for instance, how her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, from 1988, how this has become a formative text within post-colonial studies and, crucially, beyond. This exemplifies her challenge to Western scholarship, which, shows Spivak, often occludes the perspectives of minoritized groups and their struggles. The same goes for her concept of planetarity in her book, Death of a Discipline, from 2003, which further developed this critical approach and offered an alternative to the concept of globalization. Among her influential books are Critique of Postcolonial Reason, from 1999, An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, from 2012, and Ethics and Politics in Tagore, Coetzee, and Certain Scenes of Teaching, from 2018. Now, at this masterclass, Professor Spivak is joined by 5 PhD students, and I will present these. So to my immediate left here, I have Sabina Ivenes. She's a PhD student in comparative literature at the University of Gothenburg. She holds an MA in language and culture in Europe. And her current research explores the post-migrant condition in contemporary Swedish and Danish poetry. In particular, she focuses on its didactic dimensions, a focus which I think is highly relevant to this masterclass. To her left, we have Sadie Hale. She pursues her PhD work here in Bergen. She is affiliated with the Sea Times project at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Bergen. Her research project, Looking at People, Looking at Whales, draws on ethnographic fieldwork in whale tourism contexts in Arctic Norway. She's particularly interested in the relational aspect of learning and is also actively involved in disseminating research and academic thoughts in podcasts. We're also joined by Gillian Louise Melcher, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Helsinki. She's sitting to my left of Spivak. It's always complicated with right and left when you're on stage and off stage, but my left. Melcher has engaged and developed decolonial paradigms for the study and preservation of Creole languages. Melcher has also published in this field, including the book Colonial Philippines in Italian Travel Writing, which was published in 2024. She's generally interested in the entanglements of language and power, poetry and marginalization. To Gillian's left, we have Johannes Sartu. I try to pronounce it in Danish, as he has instructed me. He is a PhD student in intellectual history at Aarhus University. Currently, he's working on a dissertation entitled Staging the Subaltern, the Making and Remaking of the Past from Below. This research maps the emergence of a historiographical approach centering forgotten voices and popular agency, for instance, through the emergence of the notion itself, history from below. Last but not least, we have with us Thelma Velez, who's a PhD candidate of education and diversity and a teacher at the University of Iceland. Her background is in international education and international relations. Velez has done extensive work on intimate partner violence among immigrant women, and she has also looked at the role of the Istanbul Convention in the Icelandic context. Her current work focuses on immigrant women, employment experiences in academic spaces. Here, she will, among other things, talk about the ethics of learning. I think we should give all of them a big round of applause. Now, this is an event that is in large parts in the hands of the Holberg Laureate and the invited PhD students themselves. What will happen now is this. The 2025 Holberg Laureate, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, will first provide us all with an introduction to the theme she has chosen for this masterclass. And the theme is no less than the practice of learning. Thereafter, all the PhD students will provide us with short introductions to the research in relation to the theme before all engage in a more general discussion. This discussion will be led by Professor Spivak. Towards the end of the masterclass, we will invite the audience, as I promised, into a more general Q&A sessions, and I will moderate this final part of this event. With this, I think we should give the floor to Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who will introduce this masterclass.
Now, let's see if the subaltern can speak. But see, this is the mistake almost everybody makes that I just made. That is to say, think of themselves as subaltern because I'm in a bit of a tight spot, so therefore I'm a subaltern. No, I am just a teacher in a tight spot. Why in a tight spot? Because I'm teaching people whom I have never seen before. I have to pretend that this is the first day of classes, but then there's no future, right? So therefore we are actually staging a drama. And Byrne thought it was in my hands. I've already told them that it's in their hands. Have I not? Okay, so, all right, it's not in my hands at all. I agree to do these master classes because I learn a lot from them. So therefore, you folks, you will really steer me in whatever, because very different projects you have. Okay, the practice of learning, it's a funny thing. You have to really, the first step is to change oneself as a student. The point here is not to control things through knowledge, but to change oneself, because humanities, after all, that the project is epistemic change. And generally speaking, a kind of contrary change without the sense of, oh, we're really better. You know, so this is a very difficult thing. So not to make truth claims, not to make knowledge claims, not to make summarizing claims, not to make controlled claims. And you know, I'm being very simplistic, Johannes. It's really harder for men because the knowledge stream in life, it has been in the hands of men for so long that as a feminist, my sympathies are with the male students because they're coming into it whereas women historically have been taught not to make truth claims. They're told the truth by others, true? So to an extent, the situation of you know this already, given what you're studying, the situation of the practice of learning is a little bit different. You leave your claims at the door because those are what's going to be changed. When I told you it was in your hands, I wasn't joking. See, that is also part of what, after 60 years, I have learned a little. 60 years, however. You know, I've been a paid teacher since the fall of 1965. And so therefore, and I say to my students in this classroom, I'm not just teaching, I'm also earning my living, don't forget that. So, you know, it's paid labor, and that already makes the situation in the classroom a little easier, you know, because in Indic stuff, there is the concept of the guru, you know, the teacher who's the teacher of teachers, almost as good as all the gods, Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Reva Maheshwara. The Sanskrit shloka, which says Guru are all the three big gods, you know, Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwara, preservation, destruction, etc. That's Guru. Guruna pratima panne priyante sarva devata. Chakshurun militan yena. Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. The Guru who has opened my eyes, Chakshurun militam. Let us be devoted to that guru. I ain't a guru. No paid teacher is a guru. So this I was told when I started teaching, because I was very scared, as I am today. You know, and I was told, why are you scared? You are being paid. You're their servant. You're your student's servant. There's nothing to be afraid of, you know. So that sense of the teacher-student relationship is also the practice of the humanities, that I should be able to think that I am your servant. This is something very important rather than your... Okay, actually, servants are like this too with children. Okay, so what I have said in my written introduction is that there is no direct line from knowing to doing. This is very important for the students who choose to be my students these days, for the last few decades, because they typically come to my class because they are interested in practice. But if one assumes that you know, your project particularly has to relate to this. You know, it's a quote, male, unquote project. You will do history from below. Who are you to do history from below? That's, you know, so that, I mean, that's a question I ask myself too, because I'm an honorary male. So therefore, the idea that there is, if you know you can do, it's a bad idea. See, there is no direct line from knowing to doing. When the University of Coimbra, in Portugal, the oldest university in Europe, if you don't count continuity, when they did me the undeserved honor of inaugurating their PhD program in social sciences, I gave them the title, now listen to this carefully, Study, Know, Learn, Hear, Listen, Do, question mark. Okay, so study, and know and learn. There are three ways of relating to what you're doing in class. Study, know, and learn. There are three. And this is only in the English language. But there are corresponding thoughts in at least the languages I know, which is not many. So therefore, don't remain focused on the English words. Remain focused on, and this you will find already in Saussure. He writes at a certain point that in his, of course, he didn't write the book, his students wrote from the notes, of course, in general linguistics. He says at one point, I'm not dealing with the signifiers, the words that I just, I'm dealing with the cluster of thoughts which is expressed by signifiers in many languages. It's an unusual thing for Saussure to say, but it's very useful. I'm using the English words, but if I were to teach in my mother tongue, which I quite often do, and sometimes I teach in somewhat halting French, it would be different. But the cluster of thought, that, I'm a translation person, and especially in the below stuff, as to how these words resonate when my history is different. You have no idea. We are using the same word. But this is also one of the dangers. You're a teacher already. One of the dangers of teaching, isn't it? That, I'm supposing that you're understanding me. But words are slippery things. God knows what you're thinking as I speak. Okay, so what were the words then I gave to my Portuguese audience in English? Study, know, learn, and then two things. Hear, listen. Okay, what the real problem is not listening, because it's very pious we are, constantly learn to listen. The first thing to learn is to hear the damn thing. You're sitting together, something is happening, but some people, because of the way their attention has been focused from childhood on, they're not hearing the fact that there are many other voices at work, not just the chief one, which is why I won't do it to you. But even 2 weeks ago, when I was doing the book fair, Bangladesh book fair in New York, I'm talking, and people are talking in the back. And I say to them, hey, I'm talking to you. Why are you talking? You see, they were absolutely alarmed by this, that someone from the audience, from the stage, actually addresses them, and that I'm actually hearing them while I'm talking. See, this is the difference between, whereas if one of them puts up their hands, then I will listen. But I'm hearing these damn people in the back talking away. I can't listen to them. I don't want to listen to them. But they were very, very alarmed and somewhat happy that I knew that they were there, and I was annoyed that they would, annoyance is a relationship. So there it was. Okay, so this is the title I gave them. And then the do is the question mark, because there is no direct line from knowing to doing, none. I have Indian middle-class students who are very much into subaltern studies and this and that. And they go back home, and sometimes I see them in India, and they're completely unaware of the fact that there are servants in it, because in India, because of the situation of remote control machines, there are more servants than machines, right? Even in middle-class houses. That doesn't make the American household with the machines better, because if you knew how the machines are produced, it might be more alarming, but whatever. These Indian middle-class people who were so keen on making the subaltern speak and giving them voice and so on, they are not aware that there is a damn subaltern in their house hold, that is to say, female servants, okay? And they're not aware of that. So this business of question mark, this is also a very, very important thing. So this is why I said, who are you to do a history from below? I can't. Brodel couldn't. Yeah, good. And remember that you will probably never be able to do it, you know. But that's the effort. That's the effort. So I told my colleagues that in Coimbra that I would dwell on each cognitive position. Each one of them is a cognitive position, right? That the hard one was the necessity to move from knowing to learning. Knowing through study must, of course, be done very well. But there, the object of investigation is just that, an object. This is correct. The epistemic position there is you, the subject, are knowing the object, and it must be done through a separation and a study. To move to learning, this is very hard now, very hard. It's also a bit of an alarming moment. It's still, to move to learning, and you don't move by yourself. The change happens. You're surprised by it. You know, this is something that won't happen in one class. It may happen, and don't claim that it is already happening to you. I was happy that you said you didn't know, because if you really feel that you have the Bishop Butler complex, that is to say, you claim that you're the most humble person. So the most humble person is also the least humble person, right? Because of the most. So if you claim that you have already experienced this, it's a bad idea. Best to think that you haven't, that ultimately there will come a moment of surprise which will be more than anything you have experienced so far. Look forward through failure. Learn from mistakes. This is another thing that, you know, it's different from knowing. So when that change happens, that the situation of learning is happening, the thing that you're studying, the object of investigation must itself become something like a subject. You know, it's no longer, I mean, it becomes more phenomenological than real, because of course it can't be a subject. I remember that long ago, you folks are more or less, you are also historian anthropologists, and you know that so perhaps you know the name of Dominic Capra. Dominic, who was a historian, first-class historian, he claimed that he was really, he could apply psychoanalysis to what he was studying. And I told him, no, there is no transference while you're studying. The text is not talking back to you. In other words, I was telling him more crudely what I'm trying to tell you at length. You know, that moment of knowing, becoming, learning, that is a very alarming, scary moment, because you don't know what to do anymore. The object of investigation becomes something like a subject, and only that can lead to a change in practice. I can tell when specialists talk to me that for some, this moment has not, you know, after 50 years, has not appeared. They know everything, and they're making connections and putting me in my place. But learning can only begin when this change has happened, when just mimesis has turned to poiesis. It is an unnerving moment because your imagination is learning to suspend your cognitive machinery. You realize that your imagination is telling you, don't try to know too quickly, because this is something else. So therefore, to enter into the one implied by the text. The text implies, and this you do know, I'm sure, that the text below implies a different kind of cognitive machinery. Bern, is it okay that I'm going on for so long? Okay. So the thing is that, because he told me, he saw how little I'd written, he told me that knowing you, you will probably go on for too long. So I don't want to go on for too long. He knows me already in 2 days, see? Wait till you're learning me, dear. anyway, so therefore, when you come into this thing, you will begin to think of suspending your cognitive machinery. And the reason why I asked him, because I'm now going to give an example which no one has noticed. See, I work on W.E.B. Du Bois, and I hope some of you at least know who he is. Black man, right? On the other hand, he was a product of a really non-racist community, had never been a slave as he was growing up, as he says himself. And so his class position became, better as he was the first Harvard PhD and so on and so forth. He was always dressed proper. He wrote his best book was on the Black Reconstruction. After the Civil War in the United States, there was this Freedmen's Bureau through which the first socialist welfare state project was undertaken in the US for the freedmen and women through the emancipation after enslavement. Now, he understood that the subjects of emancipation, in other words, the people who had been enslaved, for them, the public sphere was through religion, because they had no access to anything that we would recognize as a public sphere. Other historians have also recognized this, that for subaltern communities, the only way that they can access the public sphere is by bringing religion into crisis and transforming it into the possibility of collectivity. And so Du Bois has a chapter in the Black Reconstruction, which nobody has written on. And that chapter is called The Coming of the Lord. And that was how the enslaved had narrativized the process of emancipation. My very dear friend, who's now gone, alas, the Nigerian scholar Abiola Irele, he told me that his idea was that the Black Christianity became so powerful and useful because it had a telos. It had an end, the Christian psychobiography. Whereas the most powerful religious sphere for these characters before had been animism, which is of course round, because the nature is born again every season. So therefore, it is hard from enslavement to find liberatory discourse in the comforting presence of nature, which is what animism had been. So therefore, there is now nobody tries to look at that chapter where Du Bois declares rhetorically that he cannot access them. History from below. But the powerful person shows rhetorically that he cannot access them. That's much more powerful practice than to say, I can. No. So that is my example. And the fact that all scholars writing on Du Bois ignore that chapter, because it doesn't seem to relate to the historical account of Reconstruction, and it doesn't. And they can't even recognize, because they don't know humanities-style reading, that that's perhaps the crucial chapter about practice of liberation. Wait for my book, which God knows when it's coming out, but it does pay attention to this, okay? So, and I'm bringing out a cheaper edition in my Indian press, like I said yesterday, Seagull Press. Wait for the students here, wait for that. Okay, so You can apply this much more heavily beyond just printed texts, to suspend your cognitive machinery, to enter into the one implied by the text. So Du Bois's text, which was From Enslavement to Emancipation, was the cognitive machinery it implied, was Abrahamic psychobiography, very different from an atheist sociologist. So educated in the Western way, Fisk and Harvard. So therefore, that I'm using Du Bois as an example here. The cognitive machinery implied by the text will be different from yours. And so that's what you, it's only when the thing has turned into learning situation that you can begin to learn. See, I was teaching a course with a mathematics teacher, very strong intellectual. Michael Harris, you may know his name, he just became a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was afraid of the humanities. You know, in general, the mathematics people are very contemptuous toward the humanities. And, you know, you can't do mathematics, they implied to me, but I can do humanities. I can do what you do. This is, of course, a mistake. But so when I was talking to my students that we were teaching together at Columbia, graduate class, when I was also under COVID, we were both wearing masks, that itself made it a little scary. But as I was saying, you must learn to suspend your judgment. He interrupts you as saying, mathematicians never suspend their judgment. I said, come on, man. I'm talking about the humanities. Wait until mathematics comes around. I won't ask you to suspend your judgment. You know, this is a very frightening moment. So it is really hard to do, but only when you're in that position. You suspend your cognitive machinery. You can apply this much more broadly, beyond just printed texts, beyond the disciplines, as I was saying, in society, as you want to very strongly make changes. You know, NORAD, Norway Donor Agency, it's a very strong, good donor agency. But the problem with them, when you encounter them in Bangladesh, for example, as is the problem with American social movements and even local social movements, is that the implicit idea is, especially within gender justice, become like me and you'll be emancipated. Become like me, you will be emancipated. Now, this is what changes if this humanities approach goes towards a broader situation than just printed texts. Remember, the meaning of texere in Latin, to text in Latin, is to weave, textile, weave, not to write. That's, writing is a second-degree metaphor there, not the original metaphor. If one assumes that everything in work and life is woven of many strands, this effort at braiding one's own web in with another is at least understandable, though to do it requires a lot of practice, and it can never be done fully. Our formulaic description is a prayer to be haunted, a prayer to be haunted. The braiding, not by me, because I notice here some people are losing interest because this seems gobbledygook. But actually in the doing, you begin, it really is not something that you talk about. But I must get to the end of what I wrote. The humanities, I wrote to my colleagues at Coimbra, emphasize the cognitive variations reflected in the title: study, know, learn, hear, listen, do. How can these variations, see, if you learn, listen to my speech, nobody, and there's a great deal written on Phyllis Wheatley, and that poem is extremely well known. Nobody has looked at the fact that in the semi-grammaticality of those two words, Christians, Negroes, those two nouns, it lies something that goes beyond just the poem. You see, so it's not, nobody has heard that. So if you have not heard it, you can't listen to the voice of the poem. You can be as devoted as you are to the biography of Phyllis Wheatley, which is a noble story of an enslaved child growing up into this. But you will not be able to listen to the poem because you haven't heard the poem. So to an extent, hear and then do. How can these variations enhance our work as a means to an imaginative activism that allows for the epistemological performance required? That is to say, how do you know yourself as knower and the object to be known as an object to be known? That's the epistemological performance that comes through this. Please don't be bored. I'm almost coming to an end. The epistemological performance required by those of us who work within the possibility of institutional validation for ourselves. It's a contrast. You all want PhDs. You know, it's a contrast I have myself experienced. I wanted my PhD also quite badly. So how does institutional validation, and you know, these institutions, generally the broad historical background is medieval Europe. So to an extent, I mean, even if the university is in Calcutta, you know, our motto was Bacon, advancement of learning on the shield. So that therefore, this idea of an institution with a history, basically the cluster is medieval Europe with many changes, et cetera, et cetera. So how, when we want validation for that Latin phrase, doctor of philosophy, where doctor doesn't mean what it means in our common language. It means teacher, right? Docile is the person who can be taught, and doctor is the person. So you're going from docility to doctorality with your validation in a language that isn't yours. It belongs to the top, and you want not below, and you want validation from there. So this is in complete contradiction with, you know, with those of us who want to do history from below, which more or less we all do. So, I mean, those who come to my class, and especially they are US, I mean, they're superpowered children, but they want to help the whole world, right? And they want institutional validation from an Ivy League school. I mean, I should shut up.
I think maybe we should also move into hearing from the PhD students.
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Not yet. Have a seat. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so see, those of us who work with, and if you don't have this patience, you know, and I've been brought here to teach you in one class, then you will never be able to suspend your judgment. He's getting uneasy because he's done the structure. Let him eat cake. But, you know, qu'il mange des brioches. Okay, see, brioche and cake are not the same. But in English, we say cake, manière honnête. Okay, if you want to walk the walk. So if those of us who work within the possibility of institutional validation for ourselves and our students and still think about democracy, and we want institutional validation. I was happy when I was made a university professor. Why? If you want to walk the walk rather than just talk the talk, if, in other words, you are an activist scholar, you may think of yourself, and please pay attention to this, this is a little change that's easier, as taking the relay of the text you're reading. The activist scholar is like someone who takes the baton from the text and runs somewhere else. So a relay of the text you're reading, that is a different argument, and we need not discuss it if you have no interest in it. Now let me get to know you, and then hear your questions, and let me tell you to the audience now, I love Q&A sessions because I learn a lot from them. Those are for me, I mean, in spite of the fact that I'm berating old Björn and talking and talking, really the sound, remember what I said? I told them already I'm a bad teacher because I talk too much. You don't know that secret has passed before, right? So anyway, the thing is, the Q&A sessions I love because then I'm not bored by my own voice, which I've been hearing for a very long time, because I learn a lot from them. Thank you for your interest in my work. Now I'm going to stop and wait to hear what you have to say about your projects. Carry on.
Thank you so much for this. It's a pleasure being here. My name is Sabina Ivenas, and I'm from University of Gothenburg. And I'm very happy and excited to take part of this very interesting and important conversation. My talk is more essay-like, and with perhaps a poetic touch, I will reflect on post-migrant poetry in the Nordic countries and my research position. I will... A little slower, okay? Okay, a little bit slower, yes. I will, in some sense, enter the more personalized field of identity in an attempt to follow Professor Spivak's proposal of inhabit the human in the humanities. In my talk, I will use the word poem, but in doing so, I'm not referring to a specific poem, but to the poem as such. The world is broken, paraphrasing Professor Spivak. Is there hope? The human condition is hidden in the poem. Where are we going from here? Swedish contemporary poet Athena Farrokhzad might call this poem poetry in the time of doom. It's a dystopian tale, this poem. It's about refugees, hate, violence, but also love, friends, laughter, and families. What should we call this experience? How should we refer to this poem? Globalization is since many years a fact. Since then, we have used many words in trying to grasp the many different questions of migration. Still, in relation to this discussion within academia, within the institutions, many poets of various backgrounds have to ask, am I part of this definition? Am I part of this definition? And the literary scholar must answer, I don't know yet. In my thesis, I use the term post-migration and a post-migrant condition. What is beyond migration, this terminology asks. It can be used in many ways, and I've chosen the following definition from Danish Maurice Strom's Reframing Migration, Diversity, and the Arts, the Post-Migrant Condition from 2019. To explain the complex experiences of being second or third generation immigrants in the Nordic countries, but also to include voices of transnational adoptees, a category I myself belong to, born in India, adopted and raised in Sweden. Second, to use post-migration as a theoretical lens. And third, to understand the Nordic countries as a whole, as a part of post-migrant condition, which everyone, migration background or not, is part of. In my thesis, this broad definition is under investigation. Is it useful for this time? How can we make use of it in the classroom? What can we learn from it? Poetry asks. What can we learn from poetry? The literary scholar asks. In my project, I see poetry as a source of knowledge. We should learn from poetry. Still, as I view my material, which include Nordic poets such as Danish Maja-Li Langvad, Eva Tind, Swedish Athena Farrokhzad, and Mara Lee, to name a few, I can say that this is not an easy read, and although necessary, learning from below, in Professor Spivak's words, is proved difficult when it's depicted through whatever fragments remain in the post-migrant experience. It is not a confused poem, but it creates a confused reader. It is a difficult poem, challenging the ways of readings. This post-projection of poetry, as the Danish poet and scholar Martin Glaserup prefers calling it, is on the one hand a well-trained machine using all the pieces from the historical archive. On the other hand, it is a work of poetry that strives to capture the harsh reality in the wake of fragmented experience, such as war, concentration camps, and exile are leaving us with. What is this poem, I ask? It's conceptual poetry, not embarrassed to borrow phrases, texts, or poems from others, not ashamed of drawing on other people's experiences. Is this love or hate for the other, I wonder? Is it a self-reflexive longing for the otherness within, I ask? What is this line of questions some of you might wonder, and I will answer. It's the question of defining the exile experience within comparative literature. To whom might it belong? Reframed in a more traditional set of questions. Is this exile literature in terms of being written by an exile poet, or is it exile literature as it addresses exile as a theme? I frequently get questions if my project is about representation. And to that I say yes and no. Because how do we handle the difficult task of bridging these questions into academia? In my research, I couldn't possibly say that I represent someone else. However, I'm here today in this beautiful and safe conversation and bring light to poets with different relationships to migration backgrounds who otherwise might be in the margins. When I presented part of my research at a conference, I got approached by a professor in the audience, a white older man, if that's relevant. He said, "You can help us understand this poetry. You can translate it for us." But as translation here is impossible, I cannot do that. But the situation raises thought-provoking questions about subalternity, although not in the sense that the poets I'm studying would be subaltern. In this context, they are marginalized. It's about the didactic questions. What do we read? And the question of within which spaces, curriculums, this poetry is allowed. It also raises the question of who has the possibility to speak, but also more importantly, who has the ability and responsibility to listen. What can we learn applying a post-migrant perspective? What can poetry teach us about post-migration? For scholars in comparative literature, this might be two different questions, but for the racialized poet, it might be the same. Then who should we listen to? If you want to, in line with Professor Spivak's suggestion to learn from below, it becomes an ethical question. In other words, we need to take care of these questions, not try to make them our own, but allow us to be part of them. The world is upon us, while the classroom is something very real and concrete. Yet, Professor Spivak reminds us in Crimes of Identity, the classroom is still a dream for some. The poem is, or at least should be, a safe room for readers. It's a place for hope and dreams, and then as readers, perhaps we can begin to wonder what we don't yet understand. Thank you.
Great.
Hello. How's the sound? Yeah. My name is Sadie Hale. I'm part of the Sea Times project here at the Department of Social Anthropology, and I'm delighted to be taking part in this masterclass. In northern Norwegian whale watching, the species most people want to see, and the one most reliably found, is the sperm whale. At up to 16 meters in length and 60 tons in weight, this Moby Dick whale is one of the largest and deepest diving species, and is furnished by a further superlative. He makes the loudest biological sounds on the planet. Sperm whales hunt using echolocation, emitting almost continuous rhythmic clicking noises. In 2000, recording equipment deployed off Andenes, where I work, measured clicks of up to 235 decibels, louder than jet engines, as intense as gunshots. All seems quiet above the surface, but you can follow these clicks if you know how to listen, or perhaps more accurately, eavesdrop below. This came to my attention in the early days of my PhD fieldwork while working as a whale-watching guide. Hydrophones, underwater microphones attuned to sperm whale frequencies, and a pair of headphones are used by a guide on almost every tour to track the whales below. The sense of intimacy is startling. The attention required to find a whale concentrated, tense, a whole-body effort. Without such listening, there is no watching. Philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy says that to be listening is to be inclined towards the opening of meaning. Listening uses what Stefan Helmreich calls the always-on organ, the ear, so generous, defenseless, and unfiltered in its capacities. Indeed, when listening for whale clicks, you will often hear the groan of ship engines as well. Military sonar and seismic air guns used in oil and gas exploration also litter the underwater noisescape. Global oceanic background noise has risen by 20 decibels since 1950, a 100-fold increase. Sound is whales' principal sense. Noise pollution like this is a worsening problem for them, masking their communication and even leading to strandings. Even as, and perhaps because, whales are getting harder to hear, new efforts strain to listen. It's a truism that we know more about outer space than the deep oceans, two realms marked by mystery, distance, and the challenge of communication, and whales have been to both. In 1977, Humpback Whale Song was sent to outer space on the Voyager Golden Records in an ambassadorial role for planet Earth, destined for the ears of any extraterrestrial life it might encounter. More recently, Project SETI uses advanced AI to try to decode sperm whale communication by recording them continuously in the deep seas off Dominica. The Cetacean Translation Initiative is a homonym and a deliberate nod to the SETI Institute, the organization founded in the 80s in part to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Part of whales' uncanny appeal is that they are both alien and familiar, other and family, the humans of the sea, as anthropologist Arne Kalland put it. What is a practice of learning appropriate to this relation? To learn from the other is often a question of language learning, as we've heard from Professor Spivak. Put another way, it's a question of opening towards meaning. Humpback Whale Song in space was a symbolic, even quixotic enterprise, an acknowledgement that most communication is non-verbal. Project SETI takes a more literal linguistic approach. What are the whales saying? But Spivak cautions that we must accept the untranslatable and recognize that a fully translated globe is nothing that we should desire. We do not need to know the content of sperm whales' utterances to respect their reliance upon sound. Tessel Janse has highlighted Edouard Glissant's right to opacity in this context, where opacity is a positive value, not being fully understood or understandable as a mark of respect across difference, maybe even species. Not controlling or translating everything, but holding space for what's not comprehensible in content, but meaningful in form. A return to form, then. The medium is still the message. In Norwegian sperm whale tourism, whales become visible through listening first. Listening first. Visibility has a price. We know from histories of colonial expansion, and in the whale's case, industrial whaling, that becoming visible to the powerful often just means becoming exposed. Part of the responsibility of the watcher, the listener, is learning to recognize the things that are making the other harder to hear, among themselves as well as by us. We might never know the full consequences of noise pollution on whales, but as Ove Pedersen, captain and my friend in Andenes, says in his film Blinded by Sound, maybe we should find out before we also silence the loudest animals on the planet, because if they aren't loud enough, who's going to make us listen? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Gillian Melchor from the University of Helsinki, and I'm working on a research project entitled Towards a Decolonizing Scholarship and Practice of Creole Language Preservation on the Philippine Chavacano Creole heritage. So many buzzwords, you can tell I learned the language of grant applications. But my research actually problematizes the terms decolonial and heritage. When I first applied for a funded researcher position, I didn't make the cut. Back then, the title was Untangling the Coloniality of Creole Language Heritage, Chavacano Naming Practices, Identity Alignment, and Language Preservation. My humanities, not strictly linguistic background, must have prompted me to frame my research as a process rather than a direction. Literature teaches us that the only way forward, not out, is through. To move towards a decolonizing, not just a decolonial practice of Creole language preservation, one must go through a process that begins with a turning of the text against itself. Linguists, especially Creolists, who analyze some of the world's most marginalized languages, must critically reflect on how we practice our discipline. I believe that the humanities can do the science of languages an immense service in this regard. I pay special attention to Creole languages because they are living remnants of the linguistic shock that came with colonial violence. From Tokpisin in Papua New Guinea, originally spoken by Melanesian laborers interacting with English colonists, to Haitian Creole, spoken by enslaved Africans on Caribbean plantations under French rule. Creole languages illustrate how language was both a tool and an outcome of colonial intervention. But perhaps the most enduring injustice committed to the Creole as object of knowledge is the yet to be fully eroded epistemological integrity of the notion that the Creole is merely a bastardized or a degenerate version of its colonial lexifier. For example, have a native Spanish speaker, unfamiliar with the Creole Chavacano, listen to a recording. It would likely provoke amused wonder, but beneath which could also lurk an unease provoked by the uncanny. I imagine it as a sort of linguistic equivalent to the mirror stage, except the reflection that stares back at the child seems somewhat disjointed. Despite theoretical differences about the nature of Creole languages, with some linguists categorically declaring them as the world's simplest languages, no serious linguist would suggest that Creoles are mere degenerate offshoots of their colonial lexifiers. Yet even, sadly, official institutions perpetuate this bias. A 2018 report by the Commission on Philippine Languages for the United Nations describes Chavacano as, I quote, bastardized Spanish. More concerning, the perception persists among Creole speakers today. One speaker, in a 2011 scholarly publication, describes his mother tongue as a Spanish vulgate, coarse and rustic, in contrast to Castilian, the language of the colonial elite. This is why Creoles are among the most historically marginalized languages of the world, not just due to the violent and sudden rupture that conditioned their emergence, but also the cognitive injustice committed to their speakers, who were once deemed too deficient to properly learn the language of their masters. Writing in the 16th century about evangelizing the New World, the Jesuit missionary and naturalist José de Acosta declared, "The Indio is irrational. He is, in the final account, animal." The Creolophone's anomalous speech was cast as further proof that the native was beneath human. The subaltern cannot speak properly. This was the conclusion of the Western observers doing or performing the ethnography of speaking from the 18th through the 19th century. If some of the Creole speakers today see their own mother tongue as deficient, despite desiring linguistic survival, then linguists must acknowledge that a social imperative lies at the core of our enterprise. When we document an endangered speech system, we do not only represent a language, we are actively reshaping, for better or for worse, the dynamics of a people among a multitude of peoples. Thankfully, A growing number of scholars are confronted by the basic fact that the speech systems we study are ultimately embedded in real human contexts and must therefore not be exploited as if they were abstract properties with neither material nor social consequences. Generations of empirical linguists have visited remote communities to extract linguistic data, to publish grammars of exotic languages, never to be heard from again by the speech communities. I don't mean to downplay the immense value, or in some cases, the actual real urgency of documentation in addressing language endangerment. Yet for the better part of the scientific tradition, scholars learned how to analyze and represent a language without learning from the people who speak it. Going back to the original title of my PhD project, Untangling the Coloniality of Creole Language Heritage, Chavacano Naming Practices, Identity Alignment, and Language Preservation, my thesis statement does not predict a potential finding. Inspired by Professor Spivak, I move beyond descriptive knowledge production. My thesis, rather, proposes a reflexive process aimed at potentially fostering an informed practice. I argue that preserving or documenting creoles requires first an understanding of the colonial histories that engendered them, then the social transformations shaped by these languages and their speakers, and also how Creole knowledge has so far been produced. Let me end with a few questions for which I have no answer, and therefore I seek Professor Spivak's guidance here. What does it really mean to decolonize Creole language scholarship? The core debate in Creolistics today centers on whether the term Creole is even a valid linguistic category. One side views it as merely a socio-historical label tied to colonialism and racial hierarchies, while the other side argues that Creoles actually form a distinct typological category characterized by a shared lack of features. In my PhD, I choose not to engage directly in this debate. Instead, I read the proposed definition of Creole through a deconstructive lens, drawing again on Professor Spivak's approach, questioning again and again what it is that we already know. If the defining subset of features that constitute Creole languages as a unified sign is what these systems are understood to lack, then the meaning of the sign Creole is constructed upon that which is absent rather than that which is present. This reveals that Creole linguistics' foundational query today is still entrenched in the Creole's relationship with the colonial lexifier. What the colonial language has or doesn't lack as a feature therefore marks a meaningful absence in the Creole language. I think that this debate exposes the near impossibility of a Creole lexifier epistemic decoupling. Beyond linguistics, I ask whether decolonization might be the primary means to seek cognitive justice in this field of studies. Top-down decolonization demands delinking Chavacano from Spanish to challenge lingering colonial biases that uphold the inferiority of the latter, the Creole language. Yet several Chavacano speakers reclaim their mother tongue not by rejecting their colonial past and all its attendant racialized discourses, but by reframing colonial intervention as the locus of their unique heritage in a country of over 180 ethno-linguistic groups. If the role of the scholar is that of a mediator, how can a linguist then negotiate these tensions, especially among speakers who we cannot assume nor expect to homogeneously and simultaneously desire linguistic survival and epistemic equality? I am reminded of Professor Spivak's essay on the willing suspension of disbelief of the colonial subject who utters, "I know what you said, and I also know what I heard." The language named Chavacano actually derives from an archaic Spanish adjective meaning, and I quote, something executed in an unpolished manner, without corresponding mastery, anything unworthy of praise or recognition is called chabacano. Suspending knowledge of the depreciative origin of her mother tongue, a post-colonial Creole speaker proudly declares, in standard Spanish, and I end with her words translated, "I love Spanish very much because it is the base language of my native language, which is chabacano. I would really like to learn more and deepen my understanding of the Spanish language. I consider Spanish to be very elegant, just like chabacano, as both languages are on par with each other." Thanks.
All right, am I going through? Perfect. So I'm Johannes Sato, and I'm a PhD student at the Department of History of Ideas at Aarhus University in Denmark. And I'm working on a historiographical project that looks at how various historians have worked with or tried to produce histories from below. So I'm looking at how can they say that they're doing history from below, not how I'm doing it. But let me just jump right into it, because I have a lot to cover in just 5 minutes, and probably be a bit longer than that. In her recent work, Spivak reminds us that the humanities are not about efficiency or instrumental knowledge, but about training the practice of learning. So in Teaching for a Broken World from 2024, she argued that this other directed approach is the signature of humanities teaching, an imaginative activism that patiently seeks to efface ourselves, and I quote, "to go inside the text and try to wish what the text wishes, try to desire as the text desires," end quote. And history writing, I suggest, requires a similar mindset. As historians, we're called to efface ourselves, and at least in part, to inhabit our subjects' perspectives. In this short presentation, I'll explore how we might approach historical writing from below as a practice of imaginative activism. But who speaks in these practices? Spivak famously asks whether the subaltern can ever speak or be heard within dominant systems of power. She argues that valorizing the experience of the oppressed while failing to interrogate the intellectual's own representational role leads to a troubling slippage. The intellectual represents the subaltern only to represent themselves as transparent. The anthropologist Michel Rolf-Trouillot helped sharpen this critique. In Silencing the Past from 1995, he shows that historical silences are not accidental gaps, but produced absences, the result of power operating at every stage of historical production, from what gets documented to what gets narrated. This complements Spivak's claim that the subaltern is not merely unheard, but structurally unhearable within dominant epistemic frames. For both Spivak and Trouillot then, writing history from below, and I quite deliberately use quotation marks, is about recovering lost voices as if they were simply waiting to be found. It is about confronting the systems that rendered them inaudible in the first place. My appropriation of imaginative activism in this light demands that we, as historians, stage those silences, marking not only what was said, but what couldn't be heard and why. So my own research on the historiographical thought figure of history from below finds a recurring pattern that mirrors Spivak's caution. From early romantic nationalists like Jules Michelet, the French historian, to Marxist historians like E.P. Thompson, attempts to write history from below have often been shaped by political desire. In Le Peuple from 1846, Michelet cast ordinary people, or Le Peuple, as the heroic revolutionary heart of the French nation. A romanticized symbol that unified the body politic while ignoring internal divisions of gender, race, and political descent. Over a century later, Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class from 1963 depicted a self-constituting proletariat grounded in shared customs and collective action, yet both figures were shaped by their authors' politics. Thompson's, for instance, was criticized by historians Perry Anderson and Joan Wallich Scott for idealizing the progressive male worker while neglecting conservative elements and erasing women's roles. In both cases, these subject formations become overdetermined, illustrating how the marginalized can become a ventriloquist stall for the historian's politics. In other words, agency was as much constructed as it was recovered. So Spivak's critique might be of some help to us here. The figure of the people in history has been a site of struggle. not only over who counts as a legitimate historical actor, but over the very terms of political identity and agency. As Spivak writes in Scattered Speculation on the Subaltern and the Popular from 2005, the people becomes a slogan too quickly, while the subaltern position is contentless, a position without identity until hegemonized or spoken for, end quote. The aforementioned representational gesture of history from below thus risk reinscribing the subaltern as absence, otherness, or rhetorical force by reducing the subaltern to a populist signifier instead of tracking their radical exclusion. In my dissertation, I track how this question, who constitutes the people, or similar placeholders like the masses, for example, becomes a recurring battle across the history of history from below. As Michelet puts it quite bluntly in the preface to Le Peuple, I'm coming forward to establish the personality of the people, end quote. But personality is unstable, it's contingent. Is the people a national subject? Is it a destructive mob? Is it a class-based actor? Is it a revolutionary multitude? From Michelet to Piotr Kropotkin, from Anna Julia Cooper and C.L.R. James to the British Marxist historians of the 1960s, this identity is constantly rescripted in response to contemporary political circumstances. The 1848 revolutions, the 1905 uprisings in Russia, the interwar anti-colonial ferment, and the mid-century anti-fascist and labor movements. So the task, and this is where I take guidance from Spivak and end my already too long, I guess, presentation, is not simply to recover the subaltern, but to stage structural erasure responsibly. As I've attempted to show in this short presentation, earlier efforts to write history from below, from Michelet to Thomson, have often risked substituting political desire for critical method. Projecting unity or agency onto the lost voices of history while effacing internal fractures or exclusions. This is the enduring challenge, that history from below can reinscribe the very silencing it seeks to redress by filling in absence with overdetermined identity. My appropriation of imaginative activism, then, offers a response to this challenge. It calls on historians to efface our own authority and suspend the drive to resolve or redeem. Instead, we must actively stage the silences and structures that render subaltern voices unhearable, so that their radical exclusion is not smoothed over or annulled by its inclusion. It is in this space between conceptual grasp and historical remainder that the practice of the historian of the subaltern finds its most urgent and unfinished task. As Spivak reminds us in Scattered Speculations, to historicize the subaltern, then, is not to write the history of the singular. It is the active, scrupulous, and vigilant contamination of historiography, end quote. Imaginative activism in this light is not a recovery project. It's a rigorous practice of learning that compels us to expose and confront the limits of representation and of historiography itself, ensuring that the historian's work remains accountable to the silences it seeks to illuminate. Thanks so much.
Hello, I'm Thelma Welles. I'm from the University of Iceland. As Björn said, my research is around experiences of migrant women that work in academia. And today I'm going to be addressing that towards a more ethical perspective. So my research investigates the often overlooked experiences of violence faced by migrant women working in academic institutions. Building on my previous involvement in a post-Me Too research project that examined intimate partner violence and employment-based violence among migrant women in Icelandic society. As part of the project, I conducted in-depth interviews with women from diverse backgrounds and across various job sectors. Over time, I noticed a pattern among a specific group. Migrant women working in academia. These encounters were not only intellectually formative, but personally transformative, ultimately leading me to center my doctoral research on these layered experiences of harm. At the center of my inquiry is a commitment to understanding how systemic and symbolic violence are normalized within academic spaces, and how they intersect with immigration status, cultural identity, and the politics of belonging. I draw on critical theory, intersectionality, and trauma-informed methodologies to interrogate not only what is being done to migrant bodies and minds in these spaces, but also how these forms of harm are legitimized or rendered invisible through institutional language, practices, and policies. I examine violence against migrant women in academia, a space that, at its best, claims to foster knowledge, critical thinking, and progress. Yet, for many migrant scholars, researchers, and experts, academia can be a place of subtle and persistent harm, shaped by racialized, gendered, and colonial power structures. This violence does not always manifest as overt hostility. It often takes the form of institutional silence, exclusion from decision-making, precarious labor, epistemic invalidation, and microaggressions that erode the physical and psychological well-being of an individual over time. Yet, the question remains, what kind of knowledge am I producing? Can I be a peace mouth for these women? And will my voice be heard? The ethics of learning as shaped by the humanities is not just an abstract principle. It is deeply intertwined with the structures of power that govern whose voices are heard, whose experiences are legitimized, and whose realities are rendered invisible. To study violence is to engage with narratives of suffering, exclusion, and survival. The researcher, like the reader of literature or philosophy, must resist the urge to impose easy interpretations or allow hearsay of predefined ideas to take over. Academia often demands objectivity, detachment, and categorization, yet the ethics of learning in the humanities teaches something different: the necessity of restraint, of listening before defining, of suspending judgment long enough to truly encounter the lived realities of others. When studying migrant experiences, it is tempting to structure research around predefined frameworks, legal definitions of violence, institutional policies, and statistical trends. But what of the silences? What of the stories that do not fit neatly into categories? Humanities remind us that learning is not merely about knowing an object, but about allowing oneself to be displaced into another's reality. As it used to happen when I was a young girl, sitting at the front door of my family home, reading a Princess Diary book while being warmed by the sun. Life was simple back then. If literature and philosophy demand that we step outside of ourselves to inhabit another's world, so too must research on violence and marginalization. The act of learning, when done ethically, is not just an intellectual pursuit, but a moral act. It requires researchers to navigate a delicate balance. How do we engage with stories of harm without appropriating them? How do we give voice without speaking over? John Rawls' concept of veil of ignorance asks us to imagine justice from a standpoint of neutrality. But can true neutrality exist when studying violence? The humanities teach us that rather than striving for an impossible objectivity, we must cultivate an awareness of our own positionality. Ethical research does not seek to erase the researcher, but to acknowledge the inevitable ways in which our own biases, histories, and desires shape our interpretations. In that sense, the stories I encounter are not separate from mine. I carried them not as data, but as mirrors. Their vulnerability speaks to mine, and their struggle with belonging often echoes my own. In reading literature, we are often drawn towards resolution, a satisfying conclusion, a coherent narrative, a clear antagonist. In research, the same temptation exists: the desire for clarity, for a structured argument, for a conclusion that neatly encapsulates the problem. But the ethics of learning demands something different: a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to resist closure, to acknowledge that knowledge itself is fragmented and evolving. Studying violence against migrant women means engaging with stories of systemic exclusion, of institutional silence, of harm that does not always leave visible scars. It is not enough to simply document these experiences. The ethical responsibility lies in how I interpret them, how I represent them, how I allow them to challenge the very structures of academia that shape my research. The humanities do not simply provide us with knowledge. They teach us how to know, ethically, attentively, with humility to be changed by what we learn. In my research, I see this lesson repeatedly. The importance of listening without immediate interpretation, the necessity of displacement into perspectives that challenge my own, and the responsibility to resist the simplification of complex realities. To study violence against migrant women working in academia is to confront power, silence, and resistance, is to engage with knowledge that is not neutral but deeply entangled into politics of recognition. And in doing so, I must constantly ask, whose story am I telling? Am I telling their story, or are they telling mine? And often the answer is humbling. They are telling mine. Their accounts reflect back to me the contradictions, complexities, and fragilities of the very system I inhabit. I see my own academic and migrant experience reflected in theirs, and that recognition reshapes the research itself. If the humanities teaches anything, it's that learning is not just an act of understanding, but an ethical engagement with the world, one that demands care, accountability, and a readiness not to be conformed, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all of you. And as I said, you have drawn out things from what I have written, which that's really very transformative, to use your word, for me. And as you have all indicated, it is not a transformation that will happen just now. So in fact, whatever I say now does not really reflect, I mean, this is, all of you have absolutely grasped this obvious commonsensical point that I've been making for a long time. It takes time, okay? So therefore, however I respond to you, correct me, because that will help in my final understanding of what you have said. I'm more interested really in your questions. I mean, already you have appreciated what I do and added to it rather than really questioned. I would like you to ask me questions. But I have just this sense here, what is it? You're talking about poetry as a learning tool. Why is it better? I do believe with Aristotle that it's better to choose poetry for learning. I will share with you, not now, but after I've responded briefly to everyone, briefly being the word, I was saying to them at dinner time, I never won a class prize in school because each year conduct, the comment that was made was talkative. I never had good conduct because I was the Indian English word, talkative. Okay, so what to do? Anyway, you are making me more talkative. So the question is, why is it better? Why is, as Aristotle would say, poesia is more philosophoteron than history? Why would Aristotle, why did he say that? And it's really that question that we come back to. And for you also, when you say that history must be more like the humanities, imaginative activism, what's the difference? How is it not like the humanities, even this? So this is where I'm at. And I found what you are doing so moving. I cannot tell you how interesting that is. I mean, what is it to turn sound into, as I understood you, into meaningfulness through instruments that have shown us, and that's the whole thing about digitization, informatics before digitization. Benjamin, in fact, knew it before informatics, that the origin of meaningfulness is not meaningful. What is it to, it's really not Spivak, I mean, much further before Spivak, this particular thing, I mean, what I just summarized very briefly, this question is what you confront really. You know what I mean? I mean, because unless we have this kind of thing, and the decibel content, you know, what is it, I was talking about hearing, what is it to unhear? That's your question, isn't it? So anyway, I mean, as you can see, I could really go on with both of you forever. It's so, and when I come to you, you know, it's very interesting what you closed with, you know, the equality of the creole and the so-called lexicalizing origin, right? This is something, of course, that you don't have to do any work on, because it does exist. It does exist. I mean, my French is more or less okay. When I'm in Haiti, or I'm in Martinique, and I'm trying to work through the research material, which is in Creole, the situation is immediately inverted. So what do I do is also your question. You know, perhaps this is absolutely irrelevant, but think about an example, Dante. You see, De Vulgari Eloquentia, and that's where the grammatical language was Latin. So when he says grammar, he means Latin. Italian grammar doesn't exist. The lexicalizing grammar is Latin. And all the Italians he's talking about are Latin creoles, right? And he chooses not even his own. Like, generally speaking, most people choose their own creoles. He doesn't choose his own, not Tuscan. He likes Tuscan very much, but he chooses what already has been decreolized in the creoles, creole Italian. You know, I mean, when I talked about Dante as a creole theorist, Italian scholars, especially since Italian is not really one of my languages, I mean, obviously, I work on Gramsci, I read Italian, that's not a problem, but nonetheless, it's not like French. So they had this problem. And what is she talking about? And, you know, all this subaltern stuff, Dante.
Precisely because of the depreciative connotation of the word Creole.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. And, but just, I mean, I was telling Sean, who's probably not here, the idea of having to change the word below, you know, to take it as a temporary word, whereas it will never be changed, but nonetheless it becomes temporary. So you've got that one. So there's one thing there. When did, especially Davide Messina, who teaches in Edinburgh, he wrote, I didn't even know who he was, but he had been in my audience. He wrote me an email saying, Professor Spivak, finally I'm beginning to realize that you were not depriving Dante of his importance by, so that it isn't a question of changing the word Creole.
Yes.
It's a way of seeing that to call Creole is to show power.
Exactly.
You see, so the word, is there. Don't say too quickly what it is, but, you know, because then your mind will remain on what you've just defined as me doing. Don't turn me into an object. It takes time. So the thing is, I just throw it at you to think about it, because it is, in fact, a noble model. Dante is a noble model. I mean, Aquinas and Dante took the Arabs and twisted them into something, not being able to read Arabic. Dante couldn't read Arabic. In fact, Dante read most of Ibn Rushd, etc., in Latin translation. You know, and so this, and, I mean, since this is such a powerful figure in European history, it's nice to see what's going on there. Okay, so I'm just throwing it at you. You may find it completely irrelevant. Okay, now the business of history from below, but of course, as you pointed out, I mean, people have already looked at T.P. Thompson and those characters in terms of wanting. What I'm throwing at you, again, because it takes time, I can't, I mean, all of you put so much intellectual work, and especially interpreting someone called Spivak, whom I don't know, that I can't really respond. I'm just throwing things at you, okay, and we'll go there. See, what I want you to think about is subaltern studies, the South Asian historians, because I'll tell you a very funny thing. See, I work with Romila Thapar, the ancient Indian historian, right? Now, she has no particular ambition to make this history into, I mean, ancient Indian history is, unfortunately, it's hard to say it in the European context. Aryanism, that's where it comes from. It's so, and so to do it so that she needs police presence. Still, she's in her 90s when she talks in public. She had to go underground during Indira Gandhi emergency. What was she doing? She wasn't really writing about changing and transforming ancient Indian history. She was doing history. And so her relationship, so what is the truth claim there? To say that it must be like humanities is to consider the question of the real importance of the truth claim in historiography and the real distinction between truth claim and privatizing through cultural memory. You know, Marianne Hirsch, Andreas Hüssen, they are my colleagues. I love them. And in the case of Andreas especially, the word love is important. I was explaining at dinner time why that is so. So, on the other hand, I absolutely don't agree with what they say about cultural memory, this privatization of history. So therefore, that really has to be thought of through the subaltern studies. Unfortunately, I have written a very long obituary essay on Ranjit Guha in Bengali. So, you know, you won't be, it's the best thing that I've written on him. And in fact, Partha Chatterjee wrote me an email after he read it, said, you have dared to say what we were afraid to say all through the time that we were working with Ranjit Guha, but you won't be able to read it. But nonetheless, I'll tell you what the point was there. That when, you know, his first wonderful book, Rule of Property for Bengal, which is really about turning around Marx's theory of primitive accumulation into, see, because all of this is Marxist, etc., it turns out that I'm talking more to the man. See, it has got nothing to do with his importance. It's got to do with the fact, but please understand this. I mean, it happens because of this Marxist business. So the thing is, but remember what I said, Marx is my brother. I don't learn about feminism, for example. I ain't a Marxist feminist, no. The question is, in the Marxist situation, when Ranjit Guha wrote A Rule of Property for Bengal, the permanent settlement of imperial land according to physiocracy, it was taking it and turning it into primitive accumulation from Warren Hastings. Too far, it was too long ago. He could not submit it institutional validation, could not submit it, he was not accepted, although he submitted it as a dissertation, both at the University of Calcutta and at the Sorbonne. He never got his doctorate. It was not, see, that's the power of really questioning institutional validation. His own university and the Sorbonne, neither of them, they gave him a doctorate. He never had a doctorate till the end of his life. He was Mr. Guha. So at any rate, so this he did. And then the entire subaltern studies, history from below, the entire subaltern studies came because this guy, very proud guy, was in fact in total contrast to E.P. Thompson and company. So the subaltern studies initiative, which I'm throwing at you as you threw Dante at her, the subaltern studies initiative, as Ranajit Guha is fighting with E.P. Thompson and all of those people who are trying to do history from below, calling them primitive, etc., apolitical, etc., is subaltern studies. Indeed. But go and read what he wrote in Bengali, Hindu fundamentalists. It's nobody. That's why Patho said you've written. Actually, I wrote it before he was dead. I was offering it to him. Remember all that stuff that I said in Sanskrit about Guru? The piece is entitled, the last line of that thing, Chakshurun miltam yena, he who opened my eyes. To him I offered this kind of absolutely undermining criticism from very careful work. I was scared. My pacemaker failed that night. Can you imagine? To say to him, look, I've read your Bengali stuff, you're a Hindu fundamentalist. It was incredibly difficult. So look at subaltern studies, remembering that there's a whole side which you can't know, okay? And we can talk. See, other people also can talk. And the question of representation, you see, again, I talk about subaltern studies here. Most people were very, you may know this or you may not know this because subaltern studies is not, but on the other hand, you've worked on Spivak, so you may know this, that all of the historians, when actually Ranajit Guha asked me to theorize their work, you know, that's what it was. There is a Buddhaditya, although you will be able to read that thing. It's in Onushtup, you know, the big essay. And although you're interested in music, since you are coming, you are also interested in what I do, unless you're here because we were both Bengalis, and that's a bad reason. But nonetheless, you will be able to read that piece and you will see how this distinction happens. But anyway, the idea of taking the other side, because that by Bengalis, they are incapable of reading it because they think it's poetry. And Ranajit Guha, who is a historian, is even writing about poetry. You know, he's saying, you can see that he knows nothing about European theory of the subject position, etc. So he writes a piece very much enjoyed by the Bengalis, Kobir Naam, Sarvanam. That is to say, pronoun. The name of the poet is the pronoun, you know, the I place. It's, you know, there is so much theorizing about it. He feels that he doesn't have to know theory. And is that what poetic work is? And so, I mean, I'm trashing him, which is not correct either. As I say, he opened my eyes. But it was reading his stuff that I realized that you can never ignore the subaltern. Really, once I kind of worked on what he was working on, I mean, although he did it completely differently. He was correcting historiography, whereas I was working for the subaltern. So nonetheless, it was he who made me aware, you know. So you don't always have to like me, just as I don't always like him. But on the other hand, I can never forget that that's what he gave me. You know, so that's why I immediately snapped at you when you described me. Hey,
it was an honor.
You know, well, no, it's not an honor. It's a reminder. You know what I mean? So that's my very disorganized responses. I could, in fact, draw it now into more of a unity, but here I think I really have to be brief, because it would be more interesting to hear your questions. We don't have all that much time. We have 20, yeah, we have about 20 minutes. Okay, go ahead. And you can also respond to my response and ask further questions regarding what I just, added to what you had already presented.
Anyone?
Anyone, really. On the other hand, you can behave like a class. Put up your hand. Whatever you like, just say. Why don't we just go like this? Because it's an artificial kind of placement.
Thank you. And thank you for your comment also. My question, I think, is something that you already have touched on a little bit today, and also yesterday evening when I heard you talk. It's about the humanities and the specific knowledge of poetry that I'm interested in asking you, since you're also a comparative literature scholar.
Yes.
So in teaching for a broken world, you stress the value of the humanities in the times of global crisis. And I'm interested in the Nordic context, and I wasn't sure about asking you this question, but then yesterday you told us that Stefan Jonsson had gave you some information about migration upon your visit in Lund. That was very nice to hear. I just read a piece.
You know him?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know him well.
Yeah, and I just read the piece when he describes your visit in Lund. It was beautiful. You did well.
Thank you.
Anyway, in the Nordic context, the place of literature in education is often justified in instrumental terms. So my question and my problems, both as a researcher and also as a teacher, I wonder how we as scholars and teachers can defend the specific contribution of poetry as a form of knowledge in the school context, increasingly shaped by policy metrics or national narratives.
Right. I'm not going to answer immediately. Let me hear everyone, okay?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your comment. Yes, unhearing, learning to unhear, and learning to not emit sound also that could be covering up others as they are making sound. And yeah, the question that I wanted to ask you was to do with the place of the animal other in subaltern studies, if at all, if you think it's an appropriate framing even for the animal question. And also that, complicating that and also speaking to Johannes's point, there's complexity within animals and non-human others that in a way whales are the kind of top of the chain because they are seen as charismatic and they're very literary animals.
They're so big and so loud. Forget about charisma, measure.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Big and loud and taking up a lot of space and taking up a lot of space in people's imagination also. So what of the the sea slug that nobody cares about and nobody thinks about on the bottom of the ocean
floor.
Exactly.
That is just what I tell my students in the villages.
Yeah.
About they have never seen the ocean. They've never seen any body of water. It's Western West Bengal, Eastern West Bengal. So for them, imagine, they even have to imagine the ocean like on a beach. Imagine, but carry on.
Yeah, I would just love to hear you reflect upon this because I think maybe you have addressed it in your writings, but not in things that I have read. So I'd love to hear you reflect on the place of the non-human other, but specifically the animal, non-human animal.
Yes, okay. I will answer all these questions. Go ahead.
That was actually a very useful reminder before because my question is about listening and the role of the language scholar, particularly as a mediator. I didn't have time in my presentation to talk about there are 5 varieties of Chavacano, the Creole, spoken in the Philippines, and only one of these varieties is actually stable and the rest are endangered. So when I get the chance to present at conferences and I talk about, for example, the quote what I ended my presentation with, is a Chavacano speaker from the community with a stable variety of Chavacano.
Right, you know, Prusakhan, the subaltern studies, was just translated into Kurdish. Now, there are many different, exactly in this way, varieties of Kurdish. When I asked them which, they couldn't really answer. You know what I mean? Carry on.
So, and I get asked a question, and I always go back at it because I don't know how to answer the question from my positionality as researcher, who is not from the speech community. How can we copy the initiatives of this other community? What can we do to elevate our variety, for it to survive, because the variety is endangered? And this is why my question is about listening, and why I see the task of the linguist as a mediator even between the speech communities, because I would not...
And whom? Mediator between speech community and
who among the speech communities? Yes.
That was really not my question, but
Yes.
I'll ask after I've heard everyone.
So, yeah, my question is about the listening and the relaying a message somewhat.
Okay, carry on.
So, 2 things. I think I have 10 things, but I hope that we get the chance. I was so glad you mentioned Du Bois. I would love to talk to you about Du Bois, but that's not the forum for it here. But the topic of subaltern studies, so I'm inclining to agree with Chakravorty's criticism of Guha, that he, in a sense, also falls into the Marxist category, in the sense that he can't really grasp the religious
On the
aspect.
other hand, Chakravorty is wrong because he pays no attention to that 1872 introduction that I was talking about yesterday.
Okay,
yes, carry on.
So that's the first thing, but maybe one question that distills what I want to ask you is, so in the subaltern speak, you write that the staging of the world in representation in the scene of its writing, its Darstellung, dissimulates the choice of and need of heroes, paternal proxies, agents of power, its Vertretung. So a radical practice, you write, should attend to this double session of representations rather than to reintroduce the individual subject through totalizing concept of power and desire.
Can I have the page number?
I don't have the page number with me right here. But
on your thing there isn't? Okay. That's okay. So say again.
So you distinction between Darstellung and Vertretung.
Yes.
The scene of writing.
Yes, but what do I say about it?
You said that a radical practice should attend to this double session of representation rather than to reintroduce the individual subject through totalizing concepts of power and desire.
Okay.
So this double attending prompted me for my topic of the presentation. So just ask you if you could expand on your thoughts on this,
So
how this double attending...
attend to this double session.
Double attendings, yeah, exactly, to this double sense of representation.
Have you read La Double Séance, Derrida, on Mallarmé?
No.
So that's where I borrow that phrase from.
Okay.
Double session, La Double Séance.
From?
Derrida.
Which text?
La Double Séance.
La Double Séance.
The double session.
Yeah.
Bad translation, so be careful as you read it. It's a fantastic description of a class.
I read it in French then.
Yes, it's a class. See, with the board and so on. It's you have to reenact the classroom in order to understand this double session.
Okay.
Because it's a reference.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, last. Do you believe that institutional critique from within, as a scholar in academia, is still possible? Or do we require entire new spaces for knowledge production to avoid co-optation?
Okay. Thank you very, very much. And let's see if I can just kind of hint at things. What is the time? The time, I have about 15 minutes, is that right? Okay. It is now 12?
No, we have 12 minutes.
12 minutes, okay. So let me start from there because, you know, you were the last one. The institutional criticism is what you're saying. Of course it's possible because it's happening. So I think it is even extremely difficult to, I mean, everything I'm describing is very hard. It's easy to say, I don't do it. But in fact, obviously, I'm not going to hit you over the head here. I could actually tell you, if I were really your teacher, in a happy and soft and making many jokes way, as to how you're all doing what you're supposed to be criticizing. So the real thing, very, very hard, is to be, and I'm not able to do it, really, truly, I cannot do it. And it's not just because I can't do it, it's because the world can't do it. See, the hardest thing is to know that the institutional critique is a hindrance rather than a help. You know, Zavaleta, anyone read Zavaleta here? Okay. Zavaleta, a Bolivian, they said he was the Bolivian Gramsci. It's an insult to him. It's an insult to Gramsci. Just read him for him. And if you don't read Spanish, I have had it translated by a man called Tapia, a wonderful man. So he's Zavaleta, whose work is not much known. René Mercado Zavaleta, Z-A-V-A, take it down. Z-A-V-A-L-E-T-A. Z-A, you got a pen? Here, we have no time.
Thank you.
Z-A-V-A-L-E-T-A. You should all read this. And he hasn't done gender, see? That's something, the relay, something that we must do. His point of view is that, he was a Marxist, his point of view is that if taking the Bolivian material, he made a Marxist analysis, it would be correct, and this is part of what you were saying also, it would be a correct Marxist analysis. But in order to make it correctly Marxist, many things would have to be not considered. It's not exclusion, this is a good guy. But it's just, you just don't have, you have to not consider it because you have to be able to institutionally to make it fit. So he proposed the idea of the motley society. Motley is the English translation, but it's a good translation because, you know, clowns wear motley, right? So motley society where all of the, you see, this is also the Creole argument, it's a motley society, and this is the hard part, where all of the elements, the textual elements, and Bolivia is a very, I mean, they couldn't keep the subaltern president, right? It was destroyed by the system. And so now this particular Bolivian society, it has many different kinds of strands which make up, because of the Aymara, because the Aymara are not the kind of subaltern who are, there are, in other words, Native American groups that are way below the Aymara. The Aymara have come up. I mean, if you know the work of Silvia Rivera Kusikanki, you'll know that they've come up. So that, I mean, I was talking about Yoruba and Lenape yesterday, that those are imperial names. And so if you are just being politically correct by talking about Yoruba over against English or Lenape over against Americans, you are not there yet. And so to an extent, Bolivia has this problem, very hierarchical in every way. So he actually takes every strand and says it is modern. I mean, he doesn't try to make it modern or anything, but it is, in India this is very important. It's a motley, and in every society, it's a motley society, but all of them are part of the modernity of the place. It's not like there is an Enlightenment model modern, and we must be good to the non-moderns and counter-moderns. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about counter-modernity, and it absolutely relates to your question. So what he says is the effort that we must make, very hard to do, is to take all of them as synchronically modern with different diachronies. That's what the historian should do rather than write a Marxist history. Read his book. As I say, it is somewhat cheaper because it's through Seagull Press.
Yeah.
Okay, so read his book, and you will see that this ignored person has been very helpful to all of you, and he doesn't do gender. And so in the poetry situation, one is the content of the poetry, where it becomes your definition of the post-migrant. And of course, you didn't have the time to present it in all its detail, but I'm sure that you have taken this into consideration when you said generations post-migrant energy. And I'll just give you my own example. If you see, I'm a permanent resident in the United States. I only have an Indian passport. So to an extent, what am I? I feel that I'm more American because citizenship is not just a piece of paper. So I'm more American than an immigrant because I didn't come to find justice under capitalism. I came because I was rejected read some of my interviews, rejected by Calcutta. That's why I came. And so it's a very different kind of story. But in my story, since my story is not, I'd never talk about this. My story is not what they need to know. In my story, however, I came in 1961. And it was in 1960, this I have written about, in 1965 that Lyndon Johnson changed the alien registration situation. So that before that was quota system. Nobody knew anything about anything. So there was the quota system. And in 1965, 500% Asian immigration when Johnson changed it, right? And then in the second generation of this, most of them were, of course, professional migration. Before that, in Vivek Bald's work, there is Bengalis in Harlem who were Khalasis. You said you were Indian origin, right?
Yes.
Yes, so the word Khalasi should mean something to you. It's longshore people who release stuff from ships, right? So these, what would now be called Bangladeshis, East Indian Bengalis, they jumped ship, and that's why they came to the United States. And there was a whole community of underclass Bengalis in Harlem. And they intermarried, and fantastic story. So to an extent, when the second generation migrants, after Johnson changed it, they are the ones, you see, when I came, I had no cultural problem. Why? Because there were no novels, no poems about cultural problems. Whereas now that is more or less the genre. Everybody's writing about their cultural problems when they are the daughter or granddaughter of the ones who came first. So that particular situation, in the 96th Street station, the black guy, underclass black guy, somewhat drunk, looks at me and tells me, he can tell me the truth. Go back with your green card, he says. It's correct. That's kind of, Toni Morrison herself said that the migrant doesn't come to be equal to the blacks. It's the metropolitan migrants, third generation, who can be and who are writing dissertations. So that's one part. The content, as you say, what is the postmodern? And that has to be really rather different from the fact of poetry. I'll just tell you that the people in my village schools, they were able, I can see this, after a few reading English poetry together, they don't know a word of English, right? Mun Shro and Dhananjay Lohar, the two of them, very different themselves. They told me reading poetry, and I'm saying, well, now why is this? Look, this is not something, it's not like straightforward English. Look at this. And he's made a mistake here deliberately, etc. Why this? So they told me at one point, the two together, they had talked to each other, that poetry, because it's written in that way, it's a beautiful interpretation of Aristotle. Because, they'd never heard of Aristotle, obviously, but because it's written in this strange way, every time, imagine, these are subalterns from Bengali villages. Every time, the meaning becomes different. This is why this is why it needs to exist. I used this definition in Romania. They didn't realize what I was doing, that I was taking the learning from below, as it were. Really using, I didn't tell them, look, I've learned from below. I just said, I got it from the two of my students in the villages. They didn't understand the importance of it. You see, and so it is possible to think of poetry as a medium through this definition. But then it's important, I think you said it already, not to emphasize the post-migrant content. It can be a poem about toothbrushing, but it's a poem. So keep the two things separate. Okay, now I think we have used up the time. 1 minute, it says, it can be slow. But I've said something to all of you. There's very, very much more to say. Well, thank you so much, really, and we will probably keep in touch, right? And let me know if you have followed through on the suggestions I gave to each one of you, okay?
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And of course, you realize that the mother tongue argument, the work that we are doing, the unsystematized languages, vernaculars of Africa, there I take a situation against preservation, because those are survival languages. Politicians use them just before elections, so that there's more ethnic violence, etc., etc. So that side I didn't talk about at all. We could talk about that. Okay.
Thank you so much.
What is the sea slugs? Just give me 1 second. Sea slugs on the bottom. Have you read Derrida's L'animal que je donc suis, or whatever it's called? You have read it? Yeah. Okay, then in that case, you wouldn't say again and again non-human animal, because that's the main thing he says, that there are so many different kinds of animals, from the amoeba or the sea slug to the elephant, only one kind of human. So it's miserable pride to say animal and human. There's no contrast there. Animo is his word, A-N-I-M-O-T. Try to follow that one.
Okay.
Great. I think we could have stayed here for much, much longer. I think we have all been engaged, even though the audience have not been heard, but you've been engaged, and I think we should all be happy about that. I think we've covered an enormous amount of ground. I think the whole session itself has been a practice of learning for those on the audience, in the audience, and those on stage as well. And we have covered the expanse of the planet through history, through the world's languages, its creatures, its destructive, violent, and generative capacities, its modalities of power, and the promise of the poem, perhaps. So I want to thank all of you for being here with us, to sharing your thoughts, and to engaging each other and us, and for making this into a very, very exciting masterclass. Now, the program for today here has ended, the masterclass, but we have an important event at 2 o'clock here. That's the Holberg lecture with the 2025 Holberg Prize laureate, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. So please return for that. I am sure that will be as exciting as this. So thank you very much, all of you.